I want to thank the Siegels for sponsoring Lili Nishmas, Barbara's grandfather, Avram Moshe ben Asher Anshel, whose Yahrzeit will be this week. It should be an Lili Nishmas. So we're also, the shir today is also sponsored by Baz Meir for the Refuah Shlema of his brother Shlomo Yisrael ben Saras, or Ben and that's a shir should be Refuah Krova Lavai. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to sort of look at the big picture of things. Now, I know this is the kind of shir where we all have the deck of cards in our hands, meaning to say we all have the pieces. The question is do we have just a lot of pieces, or do we have a picture? Do we have just a number of trees, or do we have a forest? I'd like to share with you just an idea, a development of an idea which I heard many years ago myself. From the mashkiach of the yeshiva that I went to, Yeshiva Kerem Yavne, Rav Avram Rivlin, one of the people who gave me my love for Tanakh, and really tremendous individual who's written many svarim on Tanakh across the board. Very fascinating thinker. He writes on the Torah, he writes on the Parashios, he writes on Esther, he writes on Yonah. He's got a lot of very fascinating works, and he's got a very unique perspective on things. So I'd like to share with you some of his thoughts, but also the broadening scope of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who has a work on the Torah called MS Yaakov. And again, it's hard to always get to know that he's talking about a bigger agenda, because he's talking on specific psukim. But if you follow carefully, closely enough, you'll find that he references himself in a number of places, and if you pull a few pieces together, there's a larger essay in formation. So that happens in a number of places across the Emes Yaakov, and this is one of them, where we get a bigger picture. So what I'd like to do is to do four things. We're going to look at the avos, the imahos, the tests, and the children, and see the pattern that extends from all of them, and how it matches itself. And the only disclaimer is whenever we do broad strokes, whenever you do broad strokes, there are details which we could question. So I'm not. It's never a fair game to say, well, this is the only way of looking at things. And there's always things that we could improve upon in terms of our bigger picture. So this is not the be-all and end-all, but this is certainly one meridian of a pattern which we're going to experience. So let's start at the beginning. We'll look at the avos themselves. Okay, we're going to take a look at Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. What distinguishes them? What makes them unique? And we'll call their emblem, who they are as a person. When we look at Abraham, we actually are very fortunate to have a passage which appears in our Torah that we read, which is in Micha, in the 7th parak. It says, Titein emes liYaakov chesed la'Avraham. When describing the avos, the Micha tells us that we give chesed to Abraham, kindness to Abraham. And now when we translate the word chesed, we think, that lemonade stand which we set up, and we contributed to that bake sale we did. We think about all these great acts of chesed. We think about Bikur Cholim and Hachnasas Kala. These are all chesed. That's true. But to really appreciate what chesed actually is, chesed is more than just all that. Those are expressions of what chesed is. Chesed is what? Well, if you have to bring it down to the core, what is chesed?
Caring.
So it can be caring, but it's more kabbalistically defined. Chesed is. That's that. You're telling me what it is. I'm asking you. You're giving its context. Chesed is essentially energy outpouring. That's what it is. Chesed is the outpouring of energy. Okay, so that means to say that when you have Avraham Avinu, he is the type of person who chesed pours out of. Therefore, he is that generates actions, that generates care, that generates a lifestyle which is projecting energy outwards. That's what chesed is. All the specific actions which we define as chesed today are expressions of that greater midah. Examples in Avraham Avinu's life, as examples. So the Torah tells us, "Vayikach Avraham es Sarai es Shaves Lot ben Achiv." This is in Parshas Lech Lecha. They're now setting up. They're putting their bags on the camel. Everybody's on their way. All their possessions, and the souls they made in Haran. Well, what souls did they make in Haran? Rashi tells us, Asher asu b'Haran, shechnisam tachas kanvei Ashkenam. That Avram and Sarah were very active together, by the way, as Rashi describes, they were very active in being able to not just talk the talk and walk the walk, but also to spread the idea. This is a fascinating concept because, up till now, in terms of thinking about monotheists and great people in Jewish history, Abraham is not the first monotheist. People say, Abraham, he discovered God. He did not discover God. There were lots of people who discovered God beforehand. I mean, Adam and Eve were pretty clear about who God was, right? After all, God created them. Chanoch, it says, Vayisalech Chanoch es Elokim, right? Chanoch walked in front of God. That's he was pretty aware of God, right? Noah, right? Noah had a conversation with Hashem. These were people who really understood God. So what was Abraham revolutionizing? What Abraham was revolutionizing was he actually spread it. Meaning to say, that energy, that experience, he felt was so worthy, not just for himself, but for the world at large. That when trying to codify, there's a lot of halachic literature on trying to codify the mitzvah of gerus, of conversion. Now, unlike our two daughter religions, Christianity and Islam, we feel very strongly about conversion. In fact, they feel so strongly that it's worthy of doing many horrific, terrible things and the murder and torture of millions throughout all ages in order to convert the apostate and the infidel. Judaism doesn't really believe the same, but nonetheless, there is a halachic debate. Is there a mitzvah of gerus? And one of the questions that arises because there's a bracha said on gerus. So in this whole debate, there's one of the opinions which is brought in the name of Rav Sadia Gaon, and it says that yes, in fact, there is a mitzvah of gerus because it stems from the mitzvah of ahavas Hashem. If you love God so much, then how could you not want everybody else to know about it? That doesn't mean to say that we walk around with the sword and the flag and we plant it wherever we go. Judaism's never done that. But nonetheless, there's this notion that if you love something so much, how couldn't you let everybody else know about it? So Avraham Avinu was the first person who believed in God enough that it actually overflowed into the rest of the world around him. That's the Nefesh Asher B'Sov. And this is towards the beginning of Avraham's career. As we move towards the end of Avraham's career later on, we move to this fascinating episode right after the whole Yishmael episode. He kicks out Yishmael, he makes his deal with Avimelech, and then he's about to enter into Akedah. We're told the following about Abraham. This is actually towards the end of his life. Vayita Eishel b'Beersheva, vayikra Shem v'Shem Hashem kel olam. So he planted an Eishel in Beersheva, and he called there in the name of God. So what exactly was going on? We're familiar with the Medrash Rashi cites. Through this Eishel, then Hashem, whether it be an inn, whether it be a tree which people ate under, either way we understand, we get the drift. That through this he called the name of God to everybody. After everybody would consume, says you got to say thank you to the person who made the meal for you. So what they think, you think, oh yes, Abraham, thank you so much. Sarah, fantastic chicken. No, I wasn't me. We're just the vehicles of getting it to you. So that's how Avraham Avinu would do it. This is another example. These are just examples in the Psukim of an example of where Avraham Avinu's experience of God transcended himself and poured outwards to the rest of the world beyond him. Titan Emes Yaakov and Chesed LaAvraham. This is Avraham's entire journey. I think it also is noteworthy to think about in terms of Avraham as a person. Avraham Avinu's all his tests are framed in two words. And those words are, are you familiar with this? There's the beginning and end of his tests. Lech Lecha. His first test, according to this, of course, debate what the first test was, but the beginning of the one explicit tests we see in the Torah are Lech Lecha me'artzecha, leave your home, leave your land, and the ending test was Lech Lecha la'aretz Moriah, go to the land of Moriah. The Akedah begins with the same words. Lech Lecha. It's fascinating. The beginning of his life, it's as if Avram is constantly moving. He's constantly right. There's never a moment of plateau. There's never a moment where you can say, okay, hang up the coat, retirement. Whiskey, or in the air-conditioned den, that's it. No, he keeps on going. He keeps on going. That's in a certain sense this notion of chesed. It doesn't ever stop. It doesn't ever stop flowing for Avraham Avinu. It never really does. Very fascinating perspective on Avraham Avinu. Now, this is all theory because we haven't really seen it play out into practice necessarily. But let's hold for a second for Avraham. The person we're going to find the most difficult person to deal with throughout all of this is Yitzchak. In all of these different schemas. It's going to be very difficult to appreciate Yitzchak. Reason is actually quite fair. is the following. So let's take a look at the parashiyos of the Torah. It's hard to read it. But let's just take a look quickly for the parashah of the Torah. First parashah of the Torah is Bereishis. Bereishis' topic is, if we talk about what are called characters who own each parashah. The character who owns Sefer Bereishis is Adam and Chava, right? You might maybe arguably Cain, so Hashem will Shais. But the point is, it was primarily Adam and his progeny, and we got 10 generations towards the end of the parashah. Fantastic. Noah, Noah kind of says it all, doesn't it? Right? So Noah really owns Noah. There is Avram at the end of it, at the tail end of the 10 generations, but again, the primary is Noah, and hence the name. Lech Lecha, of course, Avram Avinu. Vayera, of course, Avram Avinu, right? Vayera is now the bris, the angels, the Sodom, right? The Akedah, it's all Avram Avinu. Then we get to Chayei Sarah. What's Chayei Sarah about? This is interesting. So over here, now it's Avram finding, there's two topics. Topic number one is Avram finding a burial plot for his wife Sarah. Number two is finding a shidduch for Yitzchak. But fascinatingly enough, Yitzchak himself didn't do the trip. He had in the mystery. So it was Avram's extension of himself, it was Avram's agency going out to find the wife. And at this point in time, we think, okay, now enter Yitzchak, right? Because after all, that's the best we can do. Isn't there any? Now it has to be space for Yitzchak. But the funny thing is as we read a week and a day ago, told us. We kind of waiting for the stage to be set for Yitzchak, and we do see a little bit about Yitzchak. But really, if you think about Todos, and you to characterize the parasha, the primary players are really Yaakov and Esau. You could even argue Rivka was more of an active player, and Yitzchak was more of an object than a subject in that sentence. And then we're already into Vayetze, Vayishlach, Vayesha. That's all Yaakov, right? So Esau is a nice little part of the end of Vayishlach. But I mean, really, that's it. And then we head into Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi, already the Shvatim. And you kind of stand aghast and you say, well, what happened to Yitzchak? At least one parasha. One parasha. It doesn't have to have two or three like Avram and Yaakov, but maybe just something. And it doesn't happen, right? The best we can get is the beginning of Toldos. Even at the beginning of Toldos, it says, Eile told us Avram ordered his Yitzchak, and then it talks about Yitzchak's children. Like Yitzchak, very little space. In fact, the Mefarshim point out that everything that Yitzchak did at the beginning of that parasha was the same as Avram. Meaning he goes to famine in the land, he goes down to Gerar, he goes down to Gerar. He calls his wife, his sister, Avimelech accuses him. He goes and he revolutionizes. He goes and he digs wells, but they're the same wells, and his father died. Right? Meaning to say, everything is the same, and he wants to continue the bracha which his father was given, and that's the episode where Yaakov and Esau become the active players, and he becomes the passive player. Fascinating, right? Meaning, where is he? Which is what leads the Mefarshim, or the Balei Machshav, to say that actually what's going on over here is that Yitzchak's midah is Gvura. Gvura, I used to have a misnomer. Gvura I used to think means to say Ezo, Gibor. The kind of you think about the guy who can bench 280 just on the first shot. That's who the Gibor is. So that apparently, interestingly enough, the Mishnah in Perkei Avos says that's not exactly the definition of Gvura. The definition of Gvura is Yaakov is Israel. It's an incredible amount of exertion, but it's not outward exertion. It is inward exertion. Meaning to say that the person, you so want to say something to somebody. You so want to tell that person where they belong, and you manage to bite your tongue. That requires a Herculean amount of effort. That's what Gemara is. The way the Gemara says it is that the Gemara says one of the Amoraim says, "I wish I was among those people who are ne'elavim ve'enon olvim." Those people who are ne'elavim, what does ne'elav mean? They're getting insulted, and they don't do the insulting. Think about this for a moment. Let's appreciate this. A person who you're the butt of a particular joke. It's all falling on you, and you don't respond. That's what the Gemara says is a place where everybody wishes they were. The Gemara quotes a pasuk actually, the end of Shiras Devorah, Parakei in Shavtim, for those who are following along. So it says, "V'avav ketzeis hashemesh b'gvurasai." Those who love God are like the sun that leaves b'gvurasai, in Gvura. How does the sun leave in Gvura? Well, the funny thing about the sun is that you spend a little too much time in it. It ain't so good for us. It's very important. It's the greatest energy source in the world. But the sun is a very powerful entity. It's the biggest energy source we have nearby us. If our gravity was a little fractionally stronger, our summers would be unbearable. But think about the power of the sun. So Hashem describes the sun's movement as Gvura. It has its boundaries. It's just in the right spot. It doesn't overpower us. with its energy, with its light, and with its warmth. That's the model of what Yitzhak is. So psychologically, but to translate this into a psychological space, Yitzhak is the man who follows the greatest man who's ever walked the face of the earth. Think about that. Abraham is the man who not only revolutionized, we'll call it, institutionalized monotheism, and transformed the world, who's called by the people all around him, the Nasi Elohim, the Prince of God. What are you supposed to do now? If you move one step to the side, you've changed the legacy of Abraham, right? That's not good. If you move one step to the other side, you also have changed the legacy of Abraham. So what are you supposed to do? Yitzhak had the most unbelievable test, and that was his whole work in life was preserving the legacy, preserving who Abraham was. It's the same wells. It's the same destiny. That's what Gevurah is. He wasn't his own person. He was continuing because any movement would be detracting. That's a very hard role to play in life. It's a very, very hard role to play, the Yitzchak ben Abraham role. And that's why he has very little space, because that's his success. Just as a footnote to this, it's interesting to notice, Shechter suggests in his introduction to one of his second halachic works called Bereishis. So the way it works is the following. By the way, it's alphabetical. It's Eretz Satzvi, Bereishis, Ginas Egos. If you're following the alphabetical order of Rav Shechter's Svarim. So the second halachic sefer he has, which is his own chidushim, he talks about in the introduction that it is true that Yitzchak Avinu was in fact almost identical to Avram, but there are uniquenesses. I mean to say, when he was supposed to go to the famine, he didn't go to Egypt. He went to Gerar. Why? Because Yitzchak's life, and he stayed there. Yitzchak Avinu's life situation was slightly different. And this is an important thing in terms of, we'll call it intergenerational. Meaning when we preserve what our parents did, we don't do exactly the same thing, because exactly what they did in a particular era isn't always appropriate right now. It's the same idea as applied to the unique situation. That's why Rav Shechter starts talking about how Masorah works. Just a fascinating thing to keep in mind, like the subtleties that Yitzhak experienced. And this is Chesed and this is Gevurah. Now you've noticed actually that these two are extremes. Meaning to say, Chesed is the complete outpouring of energy, Gevurah is the complete withholding of energy. Those, if we were to put those as poles, there's a vast grey area in between. And in that vast grey area is where Yaakov Avinu lives. So coming back to Micha for a second, he said Emes, Yaakov. Yaakov is considered the person of Emes. Now, it is interesting to notice that you wouldn't always say that Emes is the midway between, Chesed and Gevurah necessarily, but the word itself does bespeak that. Because if we look at the word itself, of course, comes with the first letter of the alphabet, the last letter, the Aleph and the Taf, and then the Mem in the middle. So there's something about Yaakov Avinu which is midway, right? There's the Avram, then there's the Yitzhak, and there's Yaakov is somehow in the center. And apparently, balance is closer to truth than extremes. Now this is interesting because as a good demagogue, right, the only way you can really educate the masses is with extremes, right? It's much easier to get up there on the soapbox and scream about, only one way and black and white and this people good and this people bad. It's much easier to do that, right? But interestingly enough, truth is actually a little more subtle. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein used to say that the struggle of the community that we're in over here is to have passion about subtlety. Interesting point. To have passion about subtlety. We in general, it's much easier to have passion about one way or the highway. And what MS is telling us is that there's this in-between that we need to experience. So just in terms of Kabbalistically, to appreciate what this looks like, this is like the general chart of the Sephiros, as David was mentioning beforehand. We're not going to get into the more complex ones right now, but it is important to notice just the center triad, okay? Because the Sephiros work in triads. We're going to look at, of course, the Chesed, the Gevurah, and the Tiferes. So it is interesting, of course, that Avram and Yitzhak, who represent two extremes, are the Chesed and the Gevurah. They're the right and the left, right? Strength outwards, Gevurah inwards, right? Those are the two push and pulls. Tiferes, which is where Yaakov exists, is the center. Okay, so this is in terms of where we're existing. Tiferes literally means, and again, in the defunct translations into English, literally means glory. Apparently, you can get the real glory is attained when there's a bridging of those two. When it's not just one way, it's not just the other way. It's both at once, expressed in the notion of MS. I wonder if this has to do with what's called is Yaakov Ish Tam. Tam literally means, like people say, naive, simple. Perfect. But it also means perfect, right? So tamimus, right? It also means perfection. Maybe perfection is achieved at midway. Perfection is achieved when a person isn't just serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu from one midah, from another. This is important because when we start Shemona Esrei, what we do is before jumping in and saying, God, we have a relationship with you, we say, well, there's three highways that we can choose from. Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. There's three highways we can choose from in terms of our relationship with Hashem, and they've already been well-worn highways. And these are those three highways. Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes are the ways we have the ability because they've been hallowed out through the Avos. Examples of this, just as examples of Chesed. We just did this yesterday, actually. This is Yaakov Avinu's final encounter with Lava. Now remember this. For 20 years, Yaakov has been working, and he describes it. He says, you have to appreciate just the pathos over here when he talks about it. He says, Trei folai v'eisei I never brought you an animal which was dying. Anochi achatenu, miyadi tavakshenu. I always took responsibility. Genuvasi yom, genuvasi laila. I was stolen at night and day. Vayisi bayom achaleni chorev. In the day I was burnt by the sun. V'kerach balayla. Vatidad shnoisi me'einai. I lost sleep. Right? Zeli esrim shana b'veisecha v'alticha 14 shana b'shtei v'osecha v'shesh shani b'tzonecha. Yaakov was the man. What does emes look like? Fascinating enough, it looks like not sort of a chesed or a gvura. It looks like day-to-day operating with honesty. Meaning to say everything he did, there was the picture of God in the background. He felt it was a moral responsibility wherever he went, where he worked. His Yaakov, how did emes express itself? How did balance express itself? Express itself in literal honesty. And that was how Yaakov Avinu was involved. In fact, it's interesting. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky says that's why later on in this week's parasha, in Vayishlach, the brothers come in and they have this whole scheme. They're going to speak to Shechem, and they see that Dinah has been raped, and they say, just a bris milah, right? You guys go ahead and just it's just a minor surgical procedure, and we'll get back to you in 3 days. And so it's interesting that Yaakov Avinu isn't involved in that conversation at all. So Rav Kamenetsky says, that's the point. Yaakov Avinu couldn't be involved in there's nothing subversive could find its expression through Yaakov, because Yaakov Avinu's totality was through emes, right? As an example, right? So we're going to get to. We haven't got to the silent, okay? But let's just appreciate over here who he is before we look at the exceptions, okay? So if we take a look at the Avos, we're looking at three very separate ideas. But I want to see how they express themselves in another three domains in their life: Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes / emes. Those are the way we're going to look at it. So now, that of course explains a lot of things, like who they married, right? So when we work about marriage, we talked about this a little bit beforehand. Some people have this misconception that marriage is going to be this total harmonious experience. I actually saw a post last night. I think Eddie posted last night. Marriage is 90% of the time screaming what from another room. Right? That's life. Anyway, so nonetheless, I don't think that captures all of marriage. Right? Nonetheless, 90% I'd say, right? But nonetheless, the Torah tells us what marriage is supposed to be about. So the Torah tells us God gave us the instruction manuals. We often forget this. It's like, God actually did think about man and woman and gave us the way to work it out. So he says, the first time the Torah talks about loitov, everything up to now is good. Seas, good. Creepy crawlies, good. Land, good. Everything's good. Except for one thing is not loitov. What's that? For humanity to be alone, not good. Right? So therefore, response is connected. We've talked about this already about a year ago. God says, I'm going to make, at this point in time, there's two versions of the creation of humanity. At this point in time, it's the Adam 2, which means to say Adam alone, as Ezer Kenegdoi. Now, if you think about this for a second, that's an oxymoron in description, right? Ezer means help, Kenegdoi means against him. That doesn't work, right? Ezer is supportive, Kenegdoi is against. So how does this work? So the Mefarshim will debate this. The Mefarsh, which has really revolutionized the way I've seen reality, is the Netziv. Right? Now, Tzadi Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He says the following. He says, Mishusha Adam ein teva minai ba'ofen echad. He says, as you may have noticed, people don't have the same characteristics. Right? Living a few years, one sees that very few people have anything in common. Because all of creation is invested in humanity, therefore there are many different facets. So you have one person who wants one kind of lifestyle, another person wants another kind of lifestyle. Okay? So what he goes on to explain just more details because he has a footnote over here is the following: is that being as we're all different, it's a pretty big miracle that anybody can ever get married. And in a marriage, there's going to be common ground and there's going to be uncommon ground. So the common ground is where there's space for Ezer, where each side is able to support, and we'll call it eyes in the same direction, not at each other, but looking at the same horizon at least. That's the Ezer, and then there is Kenegdoi, where not everybody agrees 100% on agendas and items and where we're supposed to be going. And that's actually the best part about it, because that reforms who we are, because there's a tension which is pulling us towards a more refined center. That's really what it's supposed to be. You know, like the example is like, you know, the guy who, you know, his kind of lifestyle's very, very laid back. He's, you know, nothing, the deadlines, as Douglas Adams used to say, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound as they fly past me. You know? So that kind of guy, you know, so he gets married to somebody who's, you know, speaks the same language absolutely, and there she is. The two of them, can't get to work between the two of them before 12 o'clock in the morning, because that's, you know, they just, you know, they so get along with each other. They so, you know, they're prepared to take 3 o'clock, you know, conversations so that's not going to work. You know, it's much better if she's, you know, she's, you know, sitting there with his alarm clock above his ear, or vice versa. You know, I mean, you need to have some sort of balance. You need to see some sort of tension in life, right? You need the vice versa. He's a highly strung guy, and she's, you know, she's the kind of person who, you know, throws, you know, gas on the flames, you know, because you know, like it's going to be a disaster. You need to have some sort of balance. So that's what the Netziv said. That's the Ezer Connector aspect of life. Now, if that's true, it's interesting to focus on the wives of the Avos, or let's put it this way. Let's use a better term: the Imavos. Okay, so it is interesting. And of course, you know, they were very progressive. You know, they kept their last name. You know, so Sarah Imenu, even though it was Avram Avinu, each one of them, they managed to. It wasn't even hyphenated, right? It was so Sarah over here. We know that Sarah actually is the opposite of Avram Avinu. We see this in a few instances. Sarah is actually the opposite of Abraham, as opposed to Chesed. This is interesting. There's a lot of din or / gevura, where everything is very precise in Sarah's life. An example being is she knows that it's the right thing for Hagar to marry Abraham, because maybe ulayu ba'anem imeno, maybe there's going to be the opportunity of growth over here. But when Hagar takes her seat, Hagar becomes very full of a new position. So what does she say? She calls divine judgment on Hagar. And Hagar in fact leaves under the treatment of Sarah. Which means to say that Sarah is not for nonsense. And Sarah is not like Abraham Avinu, where there's this gentle outpouring of energy. Sarah has very specific rules. Sarah has everything regulated, everything very specific, and when it doesn't work out, there's no space for anything else outside of that. Another example later on. So when Yitzhak grows up, Abraham makes a great mishnah. She's like, then she notices that Yishmael is going through his teenage years. Right? And what mitzachek means, fascinating, lots of explanations of what that means. Obviously related to the name Yitzchak. Sorry. He ain't part of the house. Disinherited. That's it. Goodbye. And good luck. So then she said, Abraham Avinu couldn't deal with that. Right? Abraham is love. Abraham is outpouring of energy. Abraham is inclusive. Abraham, you see this? And who wins this argument? Sarah. God takes Sarah's hand. In fact, they said that Sarah had a greater level of nevuah to be able to do this. It's interesting. Isn't it interesting that Abraham and Sarah are complete balance of one another? In a certain degree, and this is the union of the Av and the Aim of who they are in particular. Moving into the next side, of course, isn't this fascinating when it comes to Rivka? I always wondered this. You know, like Eliezer is trying to look for a wife. So you know, like you can imagine what's he looking for on the resume. You know, like which seminary she went to. You know, like what's the defining factor? Who our friends are, which Rebbe is the one to call. Right? What did she do during her summer, during senior year? Well, what's he looking for? Right? So interestingly enough, he has one thing that he's looking for, one set of credentials. He makes this very heartfelt plea. This is Eliezer sitting at the well, and he says, do chesed with my servant Avraham. The daughters are about to come out to draw water. Seems to be a very good place, by the way, for shidduchim, wells. I don't know where they are in the community these days, but nonetheless, these are just definitely seems to be the right place, right? Yeah, don't talk about the park. No. So who's going to be the proof that she's worthy of Yitzchak? Is the person who's not only willing to answer my request, but is about to do above and beyond. Isn't that interesting? Why is it that Elias is looking for this? In fact, he says the word, Hashem, you do chesed with me by showing me the right person. Isn't it interesting? For the person of Gevurah, he's looking for the woman of chesed. That's going to be the emblem of who Rivka is the opposite of Yitzchak. Isn't it interesting? Like you would think, look for somebody who's the same. Look for somebody who's like, we know where she's going. Laser beam. No, that's not who she's looking for. Isn't that interesting? It's like the exact opposite of who Yitzchak is, which explains something which is very important, and that is if Yaakov is in the middle, then doesn't that make sense? If he's kind of like the combination of both, wouldn't it make sense that he has two wives, right? Of course, right? Isn't it interesting, like how that works when it comes to Rachel and Leah? And of course, we went through this a little more in more detail later on, because this really opens up who the Shvatim are and who the poles of Yehuda and Yosef are. But the Zohar HaKadosh says, Aval Razda Adamila, to Rachel and Leah, Trei Almininu. Rachel and Leah are two completely separate worlds. Chad Alma Diskasya, V'chad Alma Diskalia. One is the revealed world and one is the covered world, says the Zohar. Val da is kavirus v'ischafias l'goy ma'arta, v'ischasias v'da, kaimus b'prashas archin v'iskalia. That's why it is that one of them is buried hidden in the Maras Machpelah and one of them is buried on the road. Isn't that interesting? Who's buried in the Maras Machpelah? Leah, right? The hidden world. Who's buried on the roads? Rachel. Unfortunately today it's very much covered by that 20-foot wall. Unfortunately, but in the good old pictures when we used to be able to access it without having a stone thrown at us. So Rachel is on the road, right? So this is the Zohar is identifying the fact that these imams actually represent different poles, and of course it makes sense because Yaakov was this strident middle, which in a certain sense necessitated two different aspects in marriage, which he found in both Rachel. Now, of course, this goes on to explain a lot about Yosef and Yehuda. It's going to be very important later on to how the different kingdoms develop later on. Okay, which is very important. So just this sort of bigger, holistic picture when it comes to the Imams are almost exactly the opposite of each of each of these people. I think it's also interesting that Yaakov Avinu's wives both come from a person who was completely deceptive. It is interesting to me. That they themselves were straight, but it's interesting that just like how that develops. Now let's move into tests. We talked about honest and now tests. Now, interestingly enough, this is something which is a complete misnomer in today's society, and it really there's something so wrong with this. It's such a subtle point. But if you were to ask anybody today, what constitutes success today? You take a child and you put them through the system of Western education. What constitutes success? So they would say, well, maybe they might say, on a superficial level, people will say to you, well, go to good schools, get good jobs, and be a leader. Start a company, maybe even a non-profit, and deal with an issue or problem in the world, and give a lot of charity, whatever else it is, But like on a deeper level, they'll say, no, we know it's not just about money, right? So maybe it's about self-actualization, right? So hopefully this child can find something in themselves, which is who they should be, what they should be doing, and they find, we'll call it, the coalescing of talent and of dream and enjoyment in life, and in that overlap, that's what they're going to do. They'll self-actualize, and that's what success is. The greatest people who are loving what they're doing, whatever it is, and even if they are, street sweepers, that's a person who's really a success. Now, that's true, and I'm not trying to distract from it, but it's so much half of the picture. Like the Tehillim we say on Shabbos is the following: Sur me'arav va'asei tov, avoid evil and do good. Isn't it interesting? That before I say Tov, before we self-actualize and feel all wonderful ourselves, we need actually a Sur Me'arav. Think about this for a second. Maybe one of the reasons we could be on this earth is because God gave us a particular characteristic which He wants us to sublimate. He wants us to take care of. It could be, of course, there might be other things He wants us to self-actualize. But maybe one of our tafkim on this earth is, whether it be if we have an impatience problem, whether it be that we have a lethargic problem, whether it be that, whatever that issue is, are we working on the parts which need adjusting, or are we just self-actualizing? You could have a person, and I don't want to name some, but in the last generations, people who are phenomenal leaders, who self-actualize themselves, who are really decrepit human beings. Right? Because they never spend any time working on themselves, they only spend time working on their talents. and their creativity, which is fascinating, but that's the second half of the equation. It could be that a person's entire life is, the Sur Merah, is adjusting themselves to come out not the same lump of clay that was at the beginning. The way the Slonim Rebbe said, the Nesivos Shalom says, is Kiseitza milchama al ovecha. When you go out to war against your enemy, he says, in life, you've got to realize that you have one enemy. It's your enemy. Every person has one thing, one deep dark corner in their personality, and that deep dark corner they need to approach. Not cover it up with lots of stock and good things, because that's one half the equation. You see what's happening over here? Where is the crucible of test? Because it's not easy. Where it's not always what we feel great about. So thinking about that, let's come back to the tests now. Isn't it interesting when you look at Avram Avinu's life, and you think about tests? It's interesting that when the three Malachim arrive at Avram Avinu's tent, and there he is standing outside after Bris Milah, in the heat of the day waiting for guests. That's not one of his tests. Isn't that interesting? That's not on the count. Why not? Because that's what Avram Avinu does. That's what he does. That's what he does. He's a very, very kind person. He thinks about others all the time. He thinks about others even at his own hurt, at his own pain. Well, that's not a test. That's who he is. Isn't it interesting? If you think about all his tests involve an aspect of din or cruelty. Think about that. He leaves his father behind. Terach is left halfway along the journey. Terach dies later. That means to say his father died with him, not at the bedside. Just appreciate that. Here's Abraham, the magnanimous person who's talking to the world about God and monotheism and kindness, and there he is leaving his father. That's Lech Lecha. Right? That's a very difficult thing for Abraham to do. Bris Milah. I mean, he's talking about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu blesses us and creates perfectly, and so Hashem says, well, you're going to just make an adjustment now, Avraham Avinu, right? So means to say, everybody's looking in and saying, wait a second. Isn't that's terrible. How could you do that to a human being? A 13-year-old son, a 99-year-old man? Your whole nation, what's going to be? When of course comes to Al-Qaeda. Right? Al-Qaeda is the greatest test of Abraham. He has Abraham preaching godliness and the sanctity of the human and God's image, and then he has to sacrifice his own son. That's why Hashem says at the end, Ata yodati ki yirei Elokim ata. Now I know that you're a Yirei Elokim. It wasn't when you were doing what was good for you. That's, by the way, fantastic. Abraham was remembered as such. Nasi Elokim, everybody remembers Abraham as a kind person. But his real crucible was when it came to Gvura. That's where it was pushing him in the opposite direction of who he was. When it comes to Yaakov Avinu, of course, this is much easier to understand. If Yaakov Avinu is the man who's holistic, whose whole perspective is everything is God, he's not Gvura, he's not Din, it's all about emes, it's the center of the way. Isn't it fascinating? And Yaakov Avinu's test, of course, is when Rivka comes over to him and says, the only way to get the brachos to be really the scion of Yitzchak is to lie. He has a choice between who he is and what his destiny is. And he has to choose his destiny over his character. That was the greatest, this is the greatest test for Yaakov Avinu, was going against it. Now just appreciate this, the cost of this. Isn't this remarkable idea? Fascinating idea. This is going to me, change the way I looked at Yaakov Avinu completely. So he says to his mother, Ulai Mosheni Avi. My father might feel me. And I'm going to be an imposter in his eyes. When I was in 3rd grade, I learned this passage. That was the first time I learned that word, imposter. I still haven't quite worked out what it is. And I'll get a curse, not blessing. So what does Rivka respond? She says, no, don't worry, Yaakov. On me is your curse. That's what she says. So she says, I'll take one for the family. Right? So that's what she's saying. I'll take the club.
He doesn't say he'll be an imposter. He says, I'll be like an imposter.
You're right. It's correct, because he knows he's doing the right thing. And by the way, how?
And she never told him.
Just appreciate this. How does she know this is the right thing to do? Because it's her favorite son. And why is she saying this? Because she has a nevuah. When she went to speak to Shem, he says, Rav Yavod Tzahir. So she knows it has to come out this way. So she knows she has to manipulate the prophecy or manipulate reality to match the prophecy which only she knows about, and Yitzchak is not willing to see right now. Why she has to do it this way? Not for now. But nonetheless, right? So this is Yaakov Avinu knows this is what God wants, and this is what God made me like this. So what do I do? She says, don't worry, I'll take it for you. Shema b'koli b'lech kachli, go and do it. So the Vilna Gaon says, actually, if you look at this, the Rav Eliyahu Vilna, if you look carefully at this word, the word a lie, it's actually, he believes is an acronym. So this is shocking. He says that it stands for Esav, Lavan, Yosef. So listen to what she's saying. Think about this for a moment. This is terrifying. She says, I know that what you're about to do is going to create trouble in your life. It's going to come with a huge toll. That toll involves a lifelong and beyond lifelong, a nation-wide animosity with your brother. You're going to have to run from your brother. You're going to spend time away. And because you do that, you're going to have to spend time, and the only other family member who's local is Lovon, right? so that's going to be 22 years of Lovon. And because you spend 22 years away from home, that means to say there's going to be a son who's also going to be removed from your house for 22 years. And his name is Yosef. And what she's saying? She's saying, despite all this, despite years and years of pain, you have to do this. You see what's happening over here? You're going to suffer for your breach of character, but it's necessary, because that's what your destiny is. God is forcing him through the crucible of everything that is not him. By the way, as an interesting footnote, later on in Parshas Vayegash, when Yaakov Avinu is now in the middle of this drama, and his sons are coming backwards and forwards from Egypt, they need food, but things don't seem to be going so right, the authorities are not so friendly. So what happens is that Shimon is put in jail, now they're requesting Binyamin. So Yaakov Avinu says to Reuven, he says, Alai hayu kulana. He says, they're all on me. He says, the Lord God, what do you mean Alai? I didn't bargain for Shimon and Binyamin. I know what I bargained for. I know the cost and the pain I had to take. I did not bargain for them. That's what Yaakov Avinu was saying. There's a cost, and this cost was a very, very big toll in Yaakov's life, but that came at the expense of his test. Now, when it comes to Yitzchak, this is fascinating. We know so little about Yitzchak, so where was his test, right? That's what's interesting about this. Where was Yitzchak's test? We know so little about his life. So there's two options over here, which are very, very fascinating. One is about the future. This is what Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests. In the future, there's a Gemara which says the following, in the Gemara Shabbos Peites on Beis, which says the following story. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says the following story. Ki ato avinu Avraham, lo yodanu b'Yisrael lo yakirenu, ato Hashem avinu go'alenu me'olam shemecha. So when none of the forefathers recognize you, when Yaakov and Avraham don't recognize you, please Hashem, redeem us for your name. What does that mean? La'asid lava, in the future, yomar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'Avraham, bonecha chatuli. Hashem's going to say, Avraham, I'm looking at the balance sheets over here, and your children are not on the right side over here. We're in the red. So on the phone of Ribbon Shalom, Yimachu al Kiddush Shemecha. You know what Avraham Avinu says? Let them be wiped out in honor of your name. That's only, truth is truth. Amar Imar le Yaakov tahavalei tsar gidul bodim, efshu devoy rachmi alayo. So he suggests, maybe Hashem says, maybe I'll go to Yaakov. Yaakov knows what it is to bring out the toughness of bringing up children. He knows that not all children, fall out in the same way, in the same constellation. So Amalei bonecha chatzu. He says, Yaakov, your children sinned. Amalefonov, Ribbon Shalom, Yimachu al Kiddush Shemecha. Yaakov says, you're right. There's no excuse. There's no excuse for what they did. Let them be wiped out through Kiddush Hashem. Amar, not in the grandfathers is there reason, not in the young ones is there advice. Amar lo Yitzchak, bonecha chatzu. Turns to Yitzchak and he says, your children sinned. So let's get one thing straight. They're my children, not your children, God? Wasn't this a partnership? That's number one. You said they're your children. Let's not start this conversation about your child. How much they sin? How long did they sin? Shivim shana. Okay, so let's say an average 70 years. Dal Isrin anashta aleihem. Take off 20 because that they weren't liable for sin yet, right? Poshalu chamishin. Okay, there's only 50 left. Dal Isrin chamishin de lusa. So take off 25 because of nights. Why? We sleep most of the time, right? Okay, so I don't know, good sleeping habits in those days. So 25 years old. Poshalu Isrin chamishin. There's another 25 left. Dal tarti sorry to upaldo tsaluyu meichal uduveis lakise. Take off, we'll call it davening, eating, and restroom. Now, eating today, I don't know where we'd put that, right? Eating, so partial, meaning that's where they weren't sitting. Partial tarti sorry upalgos. There's only 12 and a half. Imatos soveles kulam mutav imlav palgo alai palgo alecha. So this we'll make a deal. If you're not going to take it, and you're not willing to take 12 and a half years per person of sinning, we'll split it up. I'll take it on my tab. So Yaakov Kamenetsky says, here's Yitzchak, here's the person of Gevurah, here's the person of Din, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Avram and Yaakov and they say, you know what, you got us. We see what's happened throughout the generations. Look how much we've fallen off the wayside. It's Yitzchak Avinu a person who is not the person of Rachamim, who is not the person of Chesed, who is not the person of MS. He's the person of Gvura, and what does he say? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, let's do a deal. This is the test of Yitzchak is in the future. This is Rabbi Yaakov Ganesi, where he has to have Rachamim in his children. If you want to go back into his life, this is Rav Mordechai Willig suggested the following. I thought this was fascinating. One last idea in Yitzchak. Where was Yitzchak in his real test? So here he is, his whole life is believed in one thing. And he's believed that Yitzchak loves Esav. He knows this is his son. For whatever reason, ideologically, psychologically, he knows that Esav is going to be his firstborn son. He's going to give him the bracha. He has destiny for him. He has a plan. You can investigate what that plan is. But he has a plan. Yitzchak is not just a passive pawn in the hands of Esav. Yitzchak has a plan. And what happens is in walks the son, and the son smells like and feels like Esav. Talks a little strange, but nonetheless, he seems to be Esav. He gives him the bracha. And then 2 minutes later, in walks Esav too. And then at this critical moment, Yitzchak realizes the following: Vayomer Yitzchak Avi, mi ata? Who are you? Vayomer ani bincha b'chorcha Esav. I am your son, firstborn Esav. Vayecharad Yitzchak charada gedola ad ma'od. And he had a very big fear. Now the word ma'od doesn't appear in the Torah so much. That means like a lot, right? And when the Torah uses a hyperbole like this, that means to say there's a tremendous amount of fear. Think what's happening. His whole life has disintegrated underneath him. His whole vision of his children, his whole vision of who his children are, who he is, what his legacy, what his destiny is, has just fallen apart in one moment when he realizes what has happened. When he realizes that somebody else has walked in and got the brachas, when he realizes that his wife was part of this, when he realizes that Yaakov really got the blessings, and this is what's happened at this moment. What does he do? What is Gvura? Gvura is where there's this, it's confined, it's restricted, there's a plan, everything is circumscribed. What does a person in that situation do? At this point in time, this could have been the breaking of the family, right? Everything could have fallen apart now. Rivka come here right now. Yaakov come in right now. Right? This could be the end of it all, right? Everything's in a split. This is my plan. What are you doing to my life? And what does he say? He says, who's that person who came? Gam Baruch here. He says the words which resonate throughout Jewish history. He will also be blessed. What is Yitzchak doing? He's admitting that the other plan was all right. For a person who is a person of Gvura to say Gam Baruch here, that was the biggest effort that could ever exist. That he accepted everything his wife said when he realized the carpet had been pulled out from underneath his chair. That is the test of Yitzchak. We'll look at those three tests. Last point, and with this we'll close. And the children, when it comes to the children. So, when we look at the different children, it is interesting to us, just to gain a perspective, that Avram has children, but only one of them really carries on being the banner bearer. Yitzchak also has two children, and only one of them carries the banner forward, whereas Yaakov has all of the Shvatim in line. It's interesting to note, because if you look at Yishmael, right, so Yishmael who's chased out, the Torah tells us that he is, the Torah tells us an interesting, okay, we can go backwards. This is a secondary idea. The idea is the following. The Torah, when describing in Vayikra, describing what incest is made up of, it says a person who marries somebody who's very close to them, incest within the family, it says, somehow incest is a notion of what the Torah calls chesed. Now that's a strange way of describing it. Chesed is kindness. That's not really kindness. If we go back to the definition of what chesed is the notion of outpouring of energy. Unfettered outpouring of energy. When there's no restrictions, there's no guidelines, there's no boundaries. The Torah says that's what ends up is incest is sort of a crippled version of chesed. So interestingly enough, when describing Yishmael, we know that Yishmael, as the Torah describes it, is a person who doesn't have boundaries. As described when the angel says about Yishmael, Yado bakol v'yad kol boy. His hands is in everybody else's pocket, everybody else's pocket, their hands is in his pocket. There's no sense of boundary. There's a lot of incest, as the Torah tells us, within the tribe of Yishmael. Why? Because it's almost like Avraham, but uncontrolled, right? It's the chesed without fettering, without space, without natural regulation, which it turns into this. Interestingly enough, by the way, translation in the Targum of this is that he needs everyone and everyone needs him. Interesting, just an interesting narrative on today's world, right? In terms of oil and energy. Just interesting observation. But nonetheless, the notion of there's this boundaryless chesed. That's the extreme of Abraham, who fell off the wayside. On the other side, you have Esav. Right? And we're told about Esav, he says, "Vayan Yitzchak Aviv vayomer, hinei mishmanei ha'aretz yesh shomeshavech, v'tal ha'shamayim me'al, v'al charbecha tichya." So his blessing is the chereb, meaning it's almost like Esav is, and you can see numerous other examples of Esav is gvura din all the way through, without any check and balance on the other side of chesed. It's all about gvura. It's all about din. There's no space for chesed in Esav's lifestyle. He falls off the other side of the highway. The way that Rabbi Rivlin described it was that if you can imagine a highway of 3 lanes, and you have a car speeding down each of the different lanes, if you have a car speeding on either extreme, the right or the left, and there's a slight change, or a slight turn, or a slight skid, the car on the side is going to automatically fall off. Right? It's going to always go off the side of the road, or into the barrier. When you have a car in the middle, even if it skids a little bit, it's still on the road, right? It's still on the road. That's what the Shil Azav, the middle road of where Yaakov Avinu was. When Yaakov Avinu is the Tiferes driving in the middle of the road, even a little bit of a skid still maintains that his children are in, which is all the Shiftei Yisrael. It is interesting. Oh, we didn't I forgot to put the Medrash in. The Medrash says in Vayikra Rabbi that it says that Yaakov had the term what was called Mita Shlema. Mita Shlema literally means his bed was full. That means to say that all his children, all 12 of the sons at least, were considered part of his continued legacy, which helps us understand something very important. In this week's parasha, when Reuven sins, right, when Reuven moves the bed of his father to the tent of Bilhah, out of the tent from the tent of Bilhah to the tent of Leah, it says the pasuk takes a break and it says Vayu b'nei Yaakov Shnei Esrei. It says that the children of Yaakov were 12. The Torah is emphasizing that even when it came to sin, even when one of the children took an extreme expression, nonetheless, they still were part of the 12. They were still part of Yaakov Avinu's destiny. They never went off the side. This is why, and this is the closing point. That's why Yaakov Avinu is on his deathbed, and he's about to tell them the Achris Hayamim. It disappears from him. He's not able to tell it. So Yaakov Avinu says, the Gemara in Pesachim describes that maybe there's a psul babana. He thinks maybe I didn't do it. Maybe I was not in the center. Maybe I was a little more extreme on either side, and somebody's going to fall off the side. And they say, no. They said to him, and that's the first time it was ever said in history, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Kashem she'en b'libcha elo echad, kach en b'libeinu elo echad. Just as you only have one God, so to us. We're all together. God took away the Achris Hayamim for a different reason. And Yaakov responded, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusa Le'olam V'ed. That the blessed is the name of God who's found its Shem Kavod Malchusa in this world. Why? When it could be that everybody's in the same fold. And that's why, finally, it took 3 of us to get to the Shiftei Yisrael. Just a fascinating perspective from, once again, learning and thinking about the Avos, the Imams, their tests, and their children. Thank you very much.